Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, my friends, when you think of state funded or state directed media, what do you think of? For me, I think of North Korea and the pink lady who speaks and boisterously shouts out the virtues of the grand leader. Or I think of the various totalitarian dictatorships around the world, around the world, who have financed public propaganda firms to push out their message and to make sure that their citizens fall into compliance. But not all state-funded or state-directed media is made equal. Indeed, the kind of media that we have in America, most of which is not state-funded, but some of which is state-funded, and that one of those entities is kind of in the discussion for us today, NPR, does not have the same tenor or appearance that state-funded media and totalitarian dictatorships have. However, it most certainly does have the same principle. And the principle is that state-directed or state-funded media, whether it's funded in part or in whole by the government, is established for purposes that may not necessarily be all that, virtuous. I'll get to that in a moment. So, what I'm talking about here, my friends, is NPR. And NPR is in the news today because, it's in the news for this week because NPR released a statement, a Twitter thread actually, on July 4th, saying that the Declaration of Independence was just replete with flaws and contradictions, basically calling the founders hypocrites and the foundation of the American experiment a hypocritical document that needs to be recognized in that light. And this is not the first time NPR has bitten itself in the foot. The organization also tweeted that Mayor Pete Buttigieg was qualified to become the transportation secretary because Mayor Pete Buttigieg proposed to his husband on an airport terminal. I am not joking with you. Here is this article from the Washington Examiner. So this is not the first time NPR has made these statements, but regardless of the sort of idiocy of NPR's claims, the reasons as to why they should not exist in the first place are eternal and universal, as are the principles of the American experiment, a truth that NPR evidently didn't understand or really didn't get the memo about. So, I'm going to give you guys 3 reasons as to why I think that we should completely defund NPR and get rid of it in terms of the government budget completely. But before I do, I know someone is going to say, well, Christian, NPR gets so little of its money from the federal government. So I want to actually go in and explain how NPR came about and how NPR is funded. So, NPR was established by the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the greatest, in my opinion, totalitarians to ever set foot into the Oval Office. So that's a different story. He announced that he wanted this act to obtain a sort of lofty heavenly purpose. He wanted this act to be able to say that America has a chicken in every pot, that America has an appetite for excellence, in his words, and that while we work every day, these are his words, to produce new goods and to create new wealth, we want to, most of all, to enrich man's spirit. That is the purpose of this act. So LBJ wanted to use force, something that negates the spirit, to enrich the spirit. And force is the government having all this money, dumping it into a particular thing, and trying to socially engineer a new reality for Americans. This is precisely why so many Americans have been stuck in dependency, and so many Americans are sort of in limbo in their relationship with the government or have bad ideas about their relationship with the government because the government has tried to socially engineer a mindset by which Americans are obedient or subservient to the government in some way, shape, or form. LBJ put this into the media so that even in the airwaves, even when Americans try to interface with information, they would have this same obsequious relationship with the government. So if the tree's roots are poison, we can probably deduce that fruit will most certainly be poison as well. So NPR eventually came out of this and was established in the 70s a few years after this act was passed. And NPR is funding right now at least 12% of NPR's member stations, because there's like NPR, the main organization, then there are the about 1,000 member stations that pay dues to the large NPR member organization, and they themselves get money from programming fees. So at least 12% of NPR member stations' budgets come from the federal government and state governments, according to their fiscal year 2017 chart. Now, this may seem small, but NPR stresses on their own website that these funds are very important for the continued operation of NPR. They say that stations pay NPR programming fees, and that constitutes most of NPR's revenue, and that if the individual stations would be unable to pay programming fees if federal funding and state funding went away. So, it is obviously vital for their operations to be federally funded, but let me give you a few reasons as to why that should not happen. Number one, the existence of a public broadcasting station or the existence of NPR itself violates the principle of free expression. So, my friends, when I say free expression, I mean that my ability to express myself is not to be interfered with. That is all free expression is meant to encompass. It does not mean that the government gives me my ability to express myself, but this is kind of what LBJ was trying to say. He wanted to enrich our spirits and cultivate excellence by giving Americans a way to express themselves through certain controlled media. But that is an inversion of the principle of free expression. That is an inversion of the proper understanding of free expression. Free expression is a negative imposition on the government not to interfere with my faculties, with the exercise of my reason, but it is not a service the government provides. So by principle, LBJ's project is rendered invalid and inert. However, we have gone away from that principle. We have deviated away from that principle so much that the negative imposition has become a positive, i.e., a mandate for the government to give us something. The very existence of the PBS and NPR violate that negative imposition. The government is not meant to provide us with a way to be excellent. The government is meant to sit back and let us be excellent on our own. The government is not meant to provide us with enriched spirits. The government is meant to allow us to enrich our spirits on our own. Virtue is not something that can be mandated by the cudgel of force, but it must instead come from the freedom, the free flow of the fountain of consciousness. And by principle, NPR violates that. That's number one, why it has to go. Number two, NPR reflects the idea of public ownership, which is itself a contradiction in terms. Now, many of you may say, well, Christian, NPR has corporate sponsorships. I get it. But guess what? Their federal funding is still very essential for their programs, number one. Number two, National Public Radio. It's in the name, and the name implies something deeper. Number three, they were established by an act of Congress, which gives even more power to the idea of a national public radio. They are meant for the quote-unquote public, and LBJ clearly meant for these people, and it was expressed through his legislation, to be used as a means of impacting the public, being for the public. So NPR itself, regardless of where it gets its money from, is, as of the moment, since it still is getting money from the government and it still is principally established by the government, NPR is still an idea of public ownership. But again, that is a contradiction in terms. If the public owns everything, they own nothing. If the public were to own the computer that I am broadcasting out of, how in the world would that even work? How in the world? Because ownership itself is not coherently conceptualized in collective terms. If everyone owns one thing, then you'll have to decide how everyone can use that one thing. And the moment a single person is to use that one thing more or differently than another person, the idea of public ownership becomes a little bit contradicted because, again, that one person is using that one thing for a particular purpose that may not be reflective of the public's benefits. So when you can situate a vague value like public ownership into law, and you can make it a part of the lexicon of the American life, you can get people not to think so much about these things and not to realize just how much of a contradiction in terms it is. Ownership, my friends, is inherently private because ownership can only be conceptualized by the traditional idea of property, and that is that I myself own myself, and from that ownership, this is the Lockean principle, everything else flows forth. My right to life and liberty come from the fact that I own myself. When you put the idea of public ownership in the hands of this gross, nebulous collective, there's no practical way this can manifest without contradicting itself, and there's no practical and there's no principled way this can manifest without contradicting what the actual principle of ownership means. But again, NPR is posited as a public station, as a public thing. And that is for a particular reason. So not only is that a contradiction in principle, in practice, it is also contradicted. When NPR receives funding from the government and is established by Congress for a particular purpose, that purpose itself is not public because, again, opinions and values are not held to this grand mass. They are individual things. NPR is established to do what people at a particular point in time with a particular set agenda wanted NPR to do. The private interest of those who wield power are enshrined in legislation, and they manifest in the forms of these public broadcasting stations. So again, there is no such thing as a public anything. Everything, in some way, shape, or form, is guided by private interests. And the private interests of LBJ are not to be taken automatically without any investigation to be the public interest of every American, either in 67 or 2021. If we want to be logical, of course. Number 3, my friends, even under the idea of public ownership, as I mentioned before, NPR itself does not work because it is guided by particular private interest, i.e. enriching the spirit, providing journalism to everybody, providing fair or reporting to everybody. But these private interests are simply governmental, and governmental interests seem to reflect the people. And if America operated under the idea of democracy, which does not, this might be plausible, but even then it would be unworkable, because the idea of democracy, again, is a contradiction of terms. But in all reality, it ignores the basic fact that actors in government have their own interests, which is why political parties exist, and which is why so many of them can't really get anything done, because they all have their own conflicting interests. If I am to trust a man in a suit in a building, a marbled building, to represent my interest, to represent all of our interests, then we're certainly doomed, because I don't think that man in that suit is going to be necessarily capable of doing the impossible. It is impossible in terms of logic for any person to know any and all interest of most people or even all people. That is impossible for a human being to do. And yet these fictions of public ownership, of public media, public, give us this mythology of the sort of omniscient legislator who can come in and represent our interests. No, it doesn't exist. We are all individuals who contain multitudes, and our interests, number 1, are very diverse and specific to our lives. Number 2, may not necessarily be able to be captured by any one sentiment or any one piece of legislation. And yet these attempts at public media, if you look at the first principles laid out by LBJ in his statement about the Public Broadcasting Act of 67, these statements of public media seem to suggest otherwise. And that suggestion, for the reasons I laid out, are absolutely false. So yes, my friends, we have to defund NPR. The very little federal and state funds that it gets need to go away. And NPR can continue to try to be sponsored by folks who actually want to deal with their private interests that are being pushed under the veil of public, good or whatever. NPR, again, in principle, is a violation of the first principles of our republic, and in practice, it is unworkable as it was set out, and in practice, it is used as a mouthpiece for certain private interests who are not only want to convince you of their own benevolence, but are probably convinced of their own benevolence, and so think that having NPR in existence is the best thing they can do to help the pursuit of information as time persists. But thankfully, information is becoming decentralized. You are the reporter, you are the knowledge gainer, and you are the one who is taking responsibility, or should take responsibility, for getting your own knowledge. Not NPR, not PBS, and not any corporate media which seek to push particular narratives under the veil of objectivity. Think on it. My friends, I love you. If you love me, please, patreon.com/officialcwatson, or PayPal, which is officialcwatson@gmail.com, or join my locals, christianwatson.locals.com, or join my Discord, which is linked down below. I love you guys so much. Please like, share, subscribe, and most importantly, my friends, please stay pensive. Bye, guys.